what we're going to talk about is bird conservation, specifically in the context of India. And it's very clear that even very, very abundant species can go very quickly extinct. The classic example is the passenger pigeon. In 1884, somebody counted that many birds. I don't know what that number is, but there's a lot of zeros and there's a lot of numbers. It's a huge number. Counted that many birds in a single flock. A single flock of passenger pigeons. People would say that the sky would darken because there are so many birds that the sun would be blocked out by these passenger pigeon flocks. There were that many. The population, and the flocks were huge, 1 mile wide flock, that's 1.6 kilometers, it's a massive flock. And the population was estimated to be about 5 billion birds, which is about 2 billion less than the global human population. And you know how our population is, that's the number of birds that there were. In the span of 100 years, they were wiped out by massive, massive hunting and targeted target people going after nests. 1914, this bird was extinct. So even very, very common birds do face the risk of going extinct. And we are now living through the 6th ever mass extinction that the Earth has ever faced. There have been 5 mass extinctions in the past, the most famous one, of course, being the end of the Cretaceous, when the dinosaurs were wiped out. We are now in what's called the Anthropocene extinction, Anthropocene being, anthropos being man, and we are now in an age where the natural world is largely defined and determined by the actions of human beings. So the extinction rates today for mammals and birds are about 1,000 times the background rate of extinction in Earth's history. So species do go extinct at some rate over time. But right now we are causing the 6th mass extinction, where the rates of extinctions of species are 1,000 times higher than the background extinction rate. So please be under no illusion, this is a crisis. We are living through a very, very epochal time in the history of Earth. A couple of bird species that have gone extinct in India already are the mountain quail from the western Himalayas and the pink-headed duck, which used to like isolated pools in tall grassland. The last record of the Himalayan quail was in 1876. The last record in the pink-headed duck was 1935. And there are some species that are still critically endangered Indian birds. Some of them are migratory, like the spoon-billed sandpiper and the sociable lapwing and the Bayer's pochard. Others occupy arid grassland habitat or scrubby habitat, like the German scoser, the Bengal florican, and the great Indian bustard. The Bengal florican occupies alluvial grassland, so flooded, seasonally flooded grassland. The white-bellied heron is a resident of fast-flowing rivers in the foothills of the eastern Himalayas. Less than 150 birds remain. The Siberian crane is now extinct in India. The population that used to migrate to India, especially Bharatpur, is now extinct. The red-headed Indian, slender-billed and white-rump vultures have been threatened by a veterinary drug called diclofenac. We're going to talk about that more later. And finally, the Bougainvillea chitala, with a global population of which does not exceed 20 birds, and it's found only in a 2 square kilometer area in near Eagle West Wildlife Sanctuary in Arunachal Pradesh. Right. When I say critically endangered Indian birds, what does that mean? Critically endangered is not just some term. There's a reason why a bird is classified as critically endangered, and those are based on criteria of population size and geographical range size. I don't want to get into all these detail over here, but just to show you that the IUCN, which is the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, classifies species according to their risk status. So you have species that are extinct, not a single individual survives. There are species that are extinct in the wild, like Spitz's macaw. It's only found in captivity anymore. There are species that are critically endangered, vulnerable. So these are the ones that are under threat. Species that are least concerned, we don't need to bother really about them. And then there are species that are not yet threatened, but they're near threatened. And these criteria, there are criteria about geographical range, size, and abundance that determine in which class a species will be. And just like the IUCN has its categories, we have in India the Wildlife Protection Act, which was passed in 1972. And the Wildlife Protection Act has 6 schedules. And animals, birds, plants are placed in these schedules depending on what kind of risk there might be under. So some birds are in Schedule 1, like the Great Indian Bustard, which is the highest risk or the highest level of protection under the Wildlife Protection Act. they're in Schedule 1. Most birds are in Schedule 4, which is a much lower level of protection. And the common crow, the house crow, is in Schedule 5, which means it's vermin and it can be killed whenever you learn. So there is no penalty for killing a house crow in India. Right. Just some conservation initiatives that have occurred in the past. At the international level, there's the Convention on the Conservation of Migratory Species. It's called the CMS, Convention on Migratory Species, specifically designed for migratory species because they have large, they have a summer range, they have a winter range, they have stopover sites. So the kind of conservation you need to protect a species like that is very different from the kind of conservation you need to protect a resident species. So there's the Convention on Migratory Species, there's the Ramsar Convention on wetlands of international importance. There is the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species, which is called CITES. CITES also has many appendices on which species are listed depending on the rate, on how threatened they are by the illegal wildlife trade. And one of the initiatives of BirdLife International and the PNHS has been to identify important bird areas. So these are areas that are important for the persistence of birds in the long term, and that's a map of important bird areas across the country. So these are just some initiatives that have been taken up for the conservation of birds. One of the other ways in which you set priorities for conservation are global biodiversity hotspots. This is a map of global biodiversity hotspots. India, there are totally, I think, 40. India spans 4. There's the Western Ghats in South India. There's the Himalayas, Indo-Burma, and then Sundaland, in which the Andaman and Nicobar Islands are. So there are 4 global biodiversity hotspots that India spans. And biodiversity hotspots are not only those areas that have a high degree of endemism, which means species that are found nowhere else in the world, they're also highly threatened. So 2 things have to combine for a place to be declared a global biodiversity hotspot. All right. What makes some species vulnerable? One of the things that makes species vulnerable to extinction is rarity. Right? And there are 6 types of rarity, depending on whether a species is a habitat specialist or a generalist, whether its local abundance, where it is found, is high or low, and its geographic range size, whether it's large or small. So if you put all these things together, you have 6 different types of rarity. The 6th category is the one that is at greatest risk, and we'll see why. Here's the first type of rarity: widely distributed, small local populations, a broad habitat tolerance. Right? So the white-rumped vulture has a huge geographic range. Right? It has small local populations, but it has a broad habitat tolerance. So that's one form of rarity, spread out over a large area, but very low densities. The second is again widely distributed. It has large local populations, but a narrow habitat tolerance. So across its range, where it is found, it is abundant, but it's found in very few places because it's restricted to certain kinds of habitat types. And the lesser adjutant is one example of that. The lesser florican is the third type of rare bird. It's widely distributed. Where it's found, it has small populations, and it also has a very narrow habitat tolerance. So it's found only in dry grassland. It cannot deal with other kinds of habitat. The Nicobar megapode is restricted to island. It has a very small geographic range, only that island. Right? It has large local populations. So on that island, it's abundant, but nowhere else. It's not found anywhere else. So it's a small geographical range, abundant on the island, and it has a broad habitat tolerance. Found in secondary forests, found in primary forests, and so on. So that's the 4th type of rarity. The 5th is species that have small geographic ranges. They're very common where they're found, but they're habitat specialists. So the black-breasted parrotbill is found only in the Duars area in northeastern India, the foothills of northeastern India, in alluvial flooded grassland, so it has very narrow tolerance, but where it's found, it's very, very common. And finally, you have birds like the white-bellied heron, which have small geographical ranges. Even where they're found, the population sizes are low, and they have a very narrow habitat tolerance. So these are the species that are most vulnerable to extinction. They've got small geographical ranges, very small local populations. So any perturbation, a disease comes in, or a flood happens, or a cyclone hits them, these are the species that are most vulnerable to extinction. All right. Rarity has another problem, a problem called stochastic extinction. What does that mean? Now, even healthy populations, like Mousumi was showing us earlier in the day, even healthy populations fluctuate. There are cycles. Populations become large, then they become smaller, then they become larger, then they become smaller, and so on. So there are cycles in population sizes, and this is one example. Populations high here, it's becoming smaller and smaller, becomes higher again, and so on. When you have a very small population, though, which means you're rare, right? You have a small population, and you're restricted to one area, which is that sixth type of rarity, right? And you're a specialist. If you get caught, if you're on your population cycle, if you get caught on the low and something happens, you're finished. That's it. That's the end of the population. You're extinct. So rare species are vulnerable to what's called stochastic extinction, extinction by chance, because in their population cycles, when they're at a low, one event can hit them, and that's what happened with this Hawaiian honeycreeper called the U. It's extinct now. When its population size was very, very low, Mauna Loa volcano erupted and the lava flowed through its habitat, making the species go extinct. So rare species, geographically limited species, at low abundances are very, very vulnerable to extinction. Right. Let's talk about some of the threats that birds face. There are a lot of them. One of the most urgent today is climate change. Climate change has multiple impacts. This is a study from the Andes mountains, and they've divided these birds into three types. There are mountaintop birds, there are mid-elevation birds, and there are lowland birds. Yeah? And what they're looking at over here is how the elevational range of these birds has changed, the size of the elevational range, how it's changed because of climate change. We know that because the world is getting hotter, species are moving up the mountain. So the temperature that was at 200 meters 10 years ago is now found at 400 meters because it's getting warmer, and as you go up the mountain, temperatures drop, right? It becomes cooler as you go up. So species are moving up in what's being called an escalator to extinction. Look at these three different types of species. Lowland species are moving up. Their elevational ranges are expanding. So this is zero, yeah? Which means no change in elevation range. If it's to the right of zero, it means your elevation range is expanding. If it's on zero, there's been no change in elevation range. If it's below zero, elevation ranges are contracting. So what's happening? Low elevation species are moving up, increasing their range sizes. Mid elevation species are simply moving up, but there's no increase in range size. The range size remains the same. Mountaintop species are getting squeezed. So if the range was here, they're moving up, up, up until they run out of space. Now, when they run out of space, they go locally extinct, and that's exactly what's happened at the Andes with these 8 species of birds. They've moved up, moved up, moved up, run out of space, there's nowhere else to go. That's it. They go extinct. That's one very important way in which climate change is affecting mountain bird communities. The other way it's affecting, Ashwin talked about this a little bit yesterday, is mismatches between timings of reproduction and timings of when prey comes out. So for example, this bird, the pied flycatcher, arrives from migration over here, lays its eggs there at this time, and then the nestlings come out when the abundance of caterpillars is the highest. So it times its breeding such that the food will be most abundant when it has to feed its nestlings. What's happening with climate change is, because it's getting warmer earlier, abundance of caterpillars is highest now when these guys lay their eggs. So the flycatcher uses day length to determine when to migrate. The insects use temperature to determine when to come out. And now because of climate change, there's a mismatch between the time at which this bird breeds and the time at which the insects emerge, which basically is resulting in poorer reproductive success for these species. So that's a bit about climate change. The other really large threat is habitat loss and degradation. This is from Indonesia, where this forest has been felled, and you can still see the stems of the trees, the trunks of the trees, to make way for oil palm plantations. Habitat loss and destruction is a huge problem, especially in grasslands in India. So grasslands historically have been considered to be a wasteland. This sort of thinking comes from British times, when British wanted timber, and the grassland, there was no timber in the grassland, so they started foresting grassland. One of the things that has happened is this shrub which is native to Southern America, Southern North America and Central America, called mesquite or prosopis, has come in and encroached onto the grassland, making them more woody. So woody trees have come in and encroached, taken over the grassland, which has been a huge problem for species like the Bengal Florican and the Great Indian Bustard, as well as birds like Jerdon's corsair, which depend on these habitats. So in terms of habitat loss in India, certainly forests are being lost, but one of the most threatened habitats in India is this grassland, is the grassland habitat. Another threat is habitat fragmentation. So fragmentation is when you isolate a patch of forest from any other forest. So this is a forest fragment. It's isolated. There's no forest connecting it to any other forest patch. It's a standalone patch of forest. So this is called habitat fragmentation. And habitat fragmentation has major effects, especially on area-sensitive species. This is a changeable hawk eagle. It requires large tracts of forest to be able to breed, to be able to feed and breed. Certainly will not be able to make it in habitat patches that are extremely small. But when you cut down the forest and create these fragments, not all species go extinct immediately. Some species will remain. So if you fragment a forest and go and count how many species are there, you find a pretty high number of species. But over time, those species will disappear. And that's called extinction debt. So when the Panama Canal was being built to connect the Atlantic and the Pacific Oceans, in the middle of the canal was this island called Barro Colorado Island. The forest got flooded, and this mountaintop remained as a forest. The rest of it got flooded, and it got isolated from all the other forest fires. 75% of bird species on Barro Colorado Island have gone extinct now over a period of 20 years. So that ocellated antbird, for example, was very common on Barro Colorado Island when it was flooded. But over time, the populations couldn't sustain themselves and they went extinct. And that's called extinction debt, which means I still have something to pay in terms of the number of species reduced. Right? So extinction debt is a phenomenon where over time, forest fragments lose species. And I think the forest fragmentation, one of the very important theories is the theory of island biogeography. The theory of island biogeography says this. You have a mainland or a source. Let's say that's a huge forest patch. Yeah? And then you have smaller patches which are island fragments, which are islands or fragments. Yeah? Which do you think will get more species? If these are coming from the mainland, which patches will get more species? The patches closer or the patches farther away? Closer ones, right? Closer ones will get a lot of individuals coming in, whereas patches that are farther will have a fewer number of individuals coming in, right? Now, a patch that's large can support large populations, and therefore the probability of extinction of those populations is low, whereas the probability of extinction in small fragments is high, because the populations that the small fragments can sustain is low. So these two things, size and isolation, determine the number of species that you find in a forest fragment. And that is the theory of island biogeography. Basically, if that's, well, we'll discuss that later. Fragmentation also has another effect which is called edge effects. So fragmentation changes, because the fragment is isolated, the edge of the fragment has different properties than the forest interior. And the edges of the fragments are vulnerable. Individuals living in the edges of the fragments are vulnerable to various things, predation, root parasitism. So we're talking about root parasitism, about birds laying eggs in the nests of other species. That is a brown-headed cowbird, that is a root parasite, and it lays eggs in the nest of the tick sizzle. This is distance from the edge of the fragment into the habitat, and that is the rate of root parasitism. You can see at the edge, very high root parasitism. As you go towards the interior of the fragment, though, root parasitism rates reduce. So fragmentation also comes with edge effects. Another threat is introduced predators. That is the island of Guam in the Pacific Ocean, and the brown tree snake was introduced into Guam by mistake. It hopped onto ships and or into the wheel bays of aircraft, and it got onto Guam where it bred usually. And because on islands birds evolved, a lot of islands, birds evolved without predators. So they tend to become flightless over time. Flight is expensive to maintain, you have to grow those muscles and so on. So birds become flightless because they don't want to incur the cost of having to create something that they're not going to end up using. And so a lot of island species are flightless, and they lay their eggs on the ground, for example, because there are no predators to eat. So rats, pigs, all these introduced predators take a huge toll on island bird fauna. And this brown tree snake is a particularly notorious example. It's ended up in Guam, and it's caused the extinction of over half the native bird species that were endemic to Guam. So they're only found in Guam, and more than half have gone completely extinct because of the depredations of the brown tree snake. Another example is the Stevens Island wren. The Stevens Island wren, I think Anand mentioned yesterday, it was found on a very small island between the North and South Islands of New Zealand. A flightless bird, it was not a wren. It looked like a wren, but it was a very specially distinct, evolutionarily distinct species. And the story goes that there was a lighthouse on that island, and the lighthouse keeper had a cat. And the story goes that that one cat was responsible for the extermination of the entire population of the Stevens Island wren. So introduced predators can have huge impacts on, especially island species. The illegal wildlife trade is picking up now as another very huge reason for birds to go extinct, birds to be threatened. So this is Indonesia. You have the songbird trade, where people actually catch birds and make them compete against each other to sing them. So there are huge competitions where birds compete. So whose song is better? This one song is better, that one song is better. And the winners can be as expensive as, into tens of lakhs of rupees. So the songbird trade has been decimating the songbird populations of Sumatra, Java, and Borneo, and that's becoming a huge problem. The other is poaching. So the helmeted hornbill, which is a Bornean Southeast Asian species, has a solid casque, a solid structure above its beak, and because elephant protection is becoming better, this is the casque of the helmeted hornbill is being used as a substitute for ivory. So the illegal wildlife trade in the casques of the helmeted hornbills is also emerging as a huge problem. This is from colonial times in Bharatpur, where, which is the Keladeo Wildlife Sanctuary, where Lord Linlithgow was the viceroy, came in, and on one day, he shot 1,476 ducks on the second shoot. On the third shoot, he had his party, of course, shot 2,568 ducks, and that, mind-blowing, staggering numbers of hunting happening, and that continues in a lot of parts of the world. For example, shorebirds that migrate from Alaska and Siberia down to Southeast Asia have to stop over in the Yellow Sea, which is eastern China, western Korea, on these large mud flats, and people put out mist nets to catch these birds for food. So that's one of the reasons why shorebird populations have declined greatly over the years. Toxins and pollution, this is a very famous example. DDT was introduced to control insect populations in the US. DDT led to the eggshells of birds like the peregrine falcon and the Eurasian sparrowhawk being about 30% thinner than normal eggshells. And so when the bird would sit on these eggshells to incubate them, the eggs would crack. And so the banning of DDT then reversed this problem. So toxins and pollution, of course you all know how plastic is affecting the oceans, how plastic is affecting biodiversity in general. In India itself, South Asia, India and Pakistan, these 4 species of vultures were highly threatened because of diclofenac, which was injected into dying cows. It's a painkiller, it was injected into dying cows, and the cow carcasses were left outside, and these birds would come and feed on these carcasses. And diclofenac is a toxin to vultures, it causes kidney failure, and because of that, populations of these vultures have declined over a very short period by about 99%. Which is a massive, massive decline in 99% in a few decades, is an unthinkable reduction in vulture numbers. And we're also seeing that with a lot of other raptor species in the Indian subcontinent, very sharp declines in abundances. Introduced disease as another cause of mortality, avian malaria in the Hawaiian Islands. Malaria never existed, mosquitoes never existed in Hawaii, and the birds obviously did not have any resistance to malaria because they never evolved with malaria. Mosquitoes came into Hawaii, humans brought mosquitoes here. They live in the lower elevations of Hawaii because they can't tolerate the cold at the higher elevations. So the lower elevation honey creepers, which are all native to the Hawaiian Islands, have gone completely extinct. So 17 of the 42 species of honey creepers in Hawaii are now extinct. The only ones that still are present are the ones that are the higher elevation honey creepers, entirely because of avian malaria. The problem is that all these threats are acting together. No, it's not as if climate change is having one impact here on this bird, trade is having an impact over here on that bird, deforestation is having an impact over there on that bird. All these threats are acting together, which makes bird conservation a very complex problem. This is a beautiful example. I mean, it's a very sad example, but it's a beautiful example of how all these threats are acting together. So if you look at this leaf bird here on the island of Sumatra, the blue outline, right, is the historical range of this species. It was found all along inside that blue outline. If you look at the light green, that's what's left of the forest, yeah, within its original range. So these green areas are the parts that were left, the other parts have been deforested. So deforestation has happened within the range of this species. In addition, this species is trapped and caught for the songbird trade. And how are they caught? People go into the forest, catch them. And it's been shown that up until if you walk straight line distance into the forest for 5 kilometers, you won't hear a bird, you won't see a bird because they've all been tracked out. So if you want to see a bird on the island of Sumatra, a forest bird on the island of Sumatra, you have to go 5 kilometers in and beyond to where the birds have not yet been tracked. But otherwise, that 5 kilometer distance, all tracked out. Multiple threats are acting together. So these dark areas now, over here, are areas that are more than 5 kilometers away from the closest forest edge. So they're more than 5 kilometers away from a road, or more than 5 kilometers away from a river. And so two things are acting together now. Habitat loss, which is deforestation, as well as the songbird trade, are now acting together to affect the populations of these species. And so what we thought would be large ranges and large populations of these species, and they're listed least concerned by the IUCN, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. Actually, these birds are under great threat because the effective amount of habitat that's left to them is a very, very small fraction of their original range size. Yeah? So, all right. I'll end here with broad guidelines for effectively conserving birds. Different birds face different threats. Different birds are in different habitats. Different birds also occur in different political and social and economic contexts. So there cannot be one formula to conserve all species of birds, right? You know, what you need to do to conserve a shorebird is very different from what you need to do to conserve a forest bird. What you need to do to tackle climate change is very different from what you need to do to tackle hunting, right? So there is no one prescription or formula that will allow you to effectively conserve all birds, but there are some general guidelines. So these are some general guidelines people have advocated. First, you have to discover that the populations of some species are declining. There are a lot of species that have probably gone extinct without even being discovered. Of the species that have been discovered, we have to monitor their populations so that alarm bells ring and a red flag is raised saying that the population of this species is going down. One of the reasons why we could do that with the vultures was because the PHS was monitoring their populations for a long time. And if you're already not using eBird, I suggest that, strongly suggest you get onto eBird and start uploading your lists onto eBird, because the eBird data, which is a collection of lists of bird watchers from all across the world, is sort of like a continuous monitoring project, right? You can use those data to look at whether the populations of birds or the occurrences of birds have increased or decreased over time. And that would sort of give us an idea of what are the species that need to be, prioritized for conservation. Because if we don't even know that the populations of certain species are declining, we're not going to do anything about it. And eBird is an excellent platform on which to upload your lists and record for yourself as well. And the information in eBird can be used to detect population declines. Once you've detected population declines, you now have to set priorities for conservation. How do you do that? Conservation resources are limited. People are, you don't have an army of people doing conservation. Funding is limited. So how do you decide where to put the money for the most effective conservation? You have to set priorities for that. And one of the ways to do that is by classifying species depending on their threat levels and saying, all right, the critically endangered species need attention first, then we move on to, or biodiversity hotspots need attention, whereas the others can wait. We need to save these critical habitats first. Once you've set your priorities and said that's a critically endangered species, that needs protection, you have to understand how the various threats are affecting this species biologically. Right? So what is it? Is it pollution? Is it toxins? Is it hunting that's reducing survival rates? Is it climate change that's changing its geographical ranges? You need to understand how the biology of the species is being impacted by the various threats that the bird faces, and then identify steps that can be taken to remedy the threats that the bird faces. A very important thing is to understand the socio-economic and political context within which you're acting. For example, large dams, which will drown out huge areas, are a political issue. So you have to work with politicians and policymakers to mitigate the impacts of infrastructure projects like roads and dams and so on. In other cases, a bird might be socially and economically very, very important for a certain community. In that case, you then have to work with local communities to try and find conservation solutions. Then you implement these actionable steps. You take those steps that you think will bring this bird back to a much more secure position than it was earlier, and you have to continuously measure the outcomes of your actions. So if you just do something and you don't know whether the population size has increased or whether the range size has increased, then there's no way in which to tell whether your conservation initiatives have been effective or not. So you have to monitor continuously. And conservation never ends. You think you've done something to deal with a particular threat, but then new threats always emerge. And you have to adaptively change the way in which you use these steps, the first 7 steps, to continuously update and change the strategies that you're using to conserve the species, because threats will emerge, new threats will emerge that did not exist earlier. So for example, when the Southeast Asian birds get completely trapped out, people are going to start looking elsewhere. So if they go to the Andamans and look for the shama, and the shama has never been hunted before, but you think it's secure because the habitat is safe, that's not necessarily true, because now hunting or trapping has been added onto it. So you have to keep evolving and updating the actions that you take for conservation. So I'll end here. After lunch, Mousumi will be talking about the case of the Indian vultures and how these steps were taken to effectively understand why vultures were declining and what measures were taken to remedy the problem that vultures were facing. So I think we'll break for lunch, and after Mousumi's presentation, maybe we'll take questions about bird conservation.
So I'm sure all of you have heard about the decline of vultures in India. Yeah? So I'll just be going through the entire case study. It's not a case study to understand how conservation works when we are trying to reverse declines of species. So, and also this happens to be something that I work on. So let me tell you about vultures. So the vultures that we are talking about today, they all belong to the genus Gyps, and they're all true vultures. When you talk about the phylogeny, like yesterday, Anand was talking about how bearded vultures and Egyptian vultures are not true vultures. These are the true vultures, and they also happen to be the only obligate vertebrate scavengers. So they exclusively feed through scavenging. None of them hunt, and they play a very important role in the ecosystem by clearing out animal carcasses. Most of them specialize on large ungulate carcasses, and in certain ecosystems, 90% of the carrions or carcasses are disposed of by vultures. So in that sense, they are extremely important in the role that they play in ecosystems. And till the 1980s, India had a very high population of these vultures. They basically the numbers ran up in millions. And at one point, it was said that white-rumped vulture was the most abundant large raptor across the world. Okay, this was before the decline, and people have said that like for the same, so these gyps species, they are found in the old world, so Europe, Asia, Africa. So there are multiple species that are distributed all across the region. And if you look at the numbers for the African vultures, they never went up as high as the numbers that we saw in India. And some people speculate that it is because of the unique livestock husbandry practices in India. So we have a huge number of livestock. It is upwards of 450 million heads of livestock, and also because of the religious practices in India, ailing and old cows and all are not sent to slaughterhouses. They die, and we dispose the carcasses out in the open. So one of the studies estimated that on an average some 65 million carcasses are available out in the open for vultures to feed on. Okay, so that's the amount of food that is there, and many experts speculate that the numbers that we saw before the decline in India were artificially inflated because of this provisioning of carcasses, which doesn't happen in the natural system, right? So, but the basic point is we had a very high population of vultures to begin with till the 1980s. The decline was initially documented in the Keoladeo National Park, which is also known as, Bharatpur in Rajasthan, in 1998, where one researcher from BNSS was doing his PhD on raptors, and he documented the nesting population going down from some 400 odd nests to absolutely nothing within a span of a few years. And by 1999, similar patterns were seen in Nepal and Pakistan in breeding colonies, like entire breeding colonies comprising of more than 400, 500 nests were completely decimated within 4 to 5 years. Okay, and between 1991 to 93 and 2000, white-rumped vultures and long-billed vultures declined by more than 92%. Okay, and the annual rate of decline was close to 48% for basically for white-rumped vultures and 22% for long-billed vultures. So this is the magnitude of decline that we saw. And the three species that were most affected by this were white-rumped vulture, slender-billed vulture, and long-billed vulture. So initially, slender-billed vulture and long-billed vulture were thought to be one species. They were split very recently. Are you aware of the distribution of these species? Yeah? So white-rumped vulture is distributed from Pakistan all the way across most parts of the plains of India, and it actually extends into Southeast Asia. And in Southeast Asia, most of the populations are now gone. There are only some isolated populations existing in Cambodia now. Otherwise, other parts of Southeast Asia don't have this. Slender-billed vulture, actually the distribution lies to the north of Ganges along the Himalayan foothills, and again it continues into Southeast Asia, and in that case also there is an isolated population in Cambodia after Northeast India. And long-billed vultures are found south of the Ganges, so basically peninsular India and Pakistan. Okay, so this is the distribution of these three species. And the first thing after they documented the decline was to figure out what caused the decline. And the investigation started in 2000, and there were initially quite a few hypotheses were put forth to explain the decline that was seen. one of the things that they thought about was it shortage of food? Okay, like is it because of there's not enough food, so the vultures are dying out? And they did a questionnaire across many parts of the vultures range, and based on the questionnaire, it did not seem like there's been a considerable decline in the amount of carrions that are available in the environment. So this was not substantiated. And the second thing that they thought about was persecution. Now, for African vultures, persecution is a major cause of their decline. So what happens in Africa is that lots of carnivores cause depredation of livestock, lions, hyenas, and such species. So people retaliate by poisoning those carcasses, and when vultures feed on them, they die. So this kind of indirect persecution through poisoning, or in some cases people might also kill the bird. I don't know instances of that for vultures, but that was also they also considered persecution to be a reason, but they didn't believe that to be the case because it was unlikely to be so widespread. Like the decline that was seen was extremely widespread all over the range in Indian subcontinent. So they didn't believe that persecution alone could have explained what they saw. One other reason they thought of was contaminants. So you heard about DDT affecting eggshell thickness and all. So they were also like this was one of the things that they explored, and so when they found dead vultures, when they were doing postmortems, they looked for the typical contaminant chemicals that are usually seen, and they did not find any of these during the postmortem. So even this was not the cause. Then they finally thought maybe it's an infectious disease because they saw nest failures and adult mortality. There was one particular behavior that people initially characterized with the vulture death, which was this drooping neck syndrome. So vultures were found to be perched on trees with their necks drooping, and that was initially associated, was thought to be a symptom of whatever was causing their death. And based on postmortem of 28 carcasses during that time, they found these symptoms. So there was visceral gout. So basically, they found uric acid deposits all over the internal organs, infection of the intestine, vasculitis, gliosis, and this paper in about 2003, they concluded that most probably it's an infectious viral disease, which is specific to it's a virus which doesn't affect other birds but only vultures, and that was their conclusion till 2003. Okay, and finally in 2004, a study was published which conclusively kind of proved that the major cause of this decline was feeding on carcasses containing diclofenac. So this study was done by researchers in Pakistan, and there's this NGO called the Peregrine Fund. So members of that NGO and some researchers in Pakistan, what they did was they did some experimental lethal experiments. So basically they dosed vultures. They used mostly injured or post reproduction phase vultures for these experiments, and they dosed them with diclofenac by directly injecting them with diclofenac, and they also fed them on carcasses into which they had injected diclofenac. Okay, and through both these processes, vultures died, and they also showed all the symptoms that were seen in the postmortem, which I talked about. So based on this, they concluded that the most likely cause of this decline is presence of diclofenac in cattle carcasses. Okay, so this study came out in 2004, sorry. And following this, what happened is a lot of NGOs working in India basically worked very hard with they basically, after they found this evidence in Pakistan, they also corroborated all the findings in India and Nepal. So basically they matched the kind of symptoms they saw in the experimental study in Pakistan with all the postmortems that were carried out in India, and it all matched up nicely. And they went, so all the NGOs and researchers working on vultures, they took forth these findings, lobbied really hard with the government of India, And as a result of this very active advocacy and lobbying, they managed to convince the government to ban the use of diclofenac in veterinary practices in 2006. Okay, so the government says, so diclofenac is an anti-inflammatory drug that is extensively used in all painkillers that we use as well. A lot of these painkiller ointments use them, sprays use them, tablets are there, injections are there. So it's a very widely used cheap drug, which is also used in humans. So they basically managed to request them and make the government ban the veterinary use of this drug. Okay, so and subsequently in September 2006, after India, Pakistan and Nepal also banned the manufacture of vials meant for veterinary use. Okay, because the dose is different for cows and humans, so it's sold in much larger vials for livestock practices and it's sold in much smaller vials for humans. So basically, in all these countries, they put in a ban on manufacture and sale of diclofenac for livestock practices. Additionally, still they found that it was available in the market. So in 2008, the government of India basically sent out a directive to label diclofenac as not for veterinary use. So all diclofenac injections meant for humans, they had to carry this label. And in 2010, Bangladesh also managed to ban the use of veterinary diclofenac. They were also seeing declines. Simultaneously, people were doing a lot of drug testing. So if you remove a drug which is so popular in veterinary practice, you have to give some alternative, right? So they tested a lot of alternative drugs which work, which have the same therapeutic effect. And after a lot of testing, they came up with meloxicam, which was tested on live vultures, and they did not die after, so after that, this was put forth as a safe alternative to diclofenac, and the government and all the agencies involved with vulture conservation worked a lot to replace diclofenac in pharmacies with meloxicam. What is interesting is that when it was identified as a vulture safe drug, it was under a patent by a German company. But people actually managed to convince the company to withdraw the patent so that it could be produced and manufactured at a very cheap cost. Okay, so even a company helped in the process. Simultaneously, they were also monitoring vultures, because when you put, as Umesh talked about earlier, when you implement some conservation actions, you also want to know if it is really having an effect or not. Because if it's not effective, then what's the point of putting in so much effort? So for vultures, since the 1990s, the Bombay Natural History Society had this project monitoring raptors in many parts of the country in forested areas. So they had 99 transects inside protected areas and 55 transects outside protected areas. And here in this map, the transects are marked with the stars. So what happens is people drive on these roads every 2 years and count all the raptors that they encounter. Okay, so basically, even before the decline was documented and confirmed, they were monitoring numbers, and this has been continued ever since. Okay, so based on the records of vultures the number of vultures that they saw, they developed an index. Some index is basically not exactly the abundance or density. It's a surrogate, or it's some sort of like it's correlated to the abundance in some sense. So it's a very crude way of looking at it, but that's the best we have. So that's the index, and you can see that, so these are the results from that survey. So you can see the vultures have been, and that's on a log scale, okay? So it's an index, so it's not actually the numbers. So you can see that the white-round vultures have been declining, so have the long-billed vultures, and according to the most recent survey, which was in 2015, slender-billed vultures, there are only about 1,400 individuals left in the wild. Long-billed vultures are doing better, around 11.5 thousand, and white-round vultures, there are only about 6,000 remaining in the wild. Simultaneously, they have also been trying to look at the prevalence of diclofenac in the environment, in cattle carcasses. So all these circles that you see are places where they have been going and collecting liver samples from cattle whole carcasses and carcass dumps. And then they measure the amount of diclofenac that is there. And when the decline was first noticed, people also built some simulation models. So basically, they tried to work out what proportion of the carcasses that are there available to vultures, what proportion needed to have diclofenac for it to have caused this kind of decline. And you won't believe, only 0.8% of the carcasses needed to have that much diclofenac to have caused 99.9% decline in the population. So it's a very minuscule amount. So even if 0.8% of the carcasses contain lethal amount of diclofenac, basically it's not safe for vultures out there. And so that is one thing. But let's look at the effects of the ban. Yeah. So as I told you, diclofenac was banned in veterinary practices in 2006. And so basically they monitored the amount of diclofenac that is there in cattle carcasses, and it came down from 11% to 6%. Okay, within 4 years. So basically, it shows that yes, the ban was having an effect, and even when you look at the index, population index, it seems like following the ban. So the error bars are really huge, so you can't really say that they're recovering really, but it seems like the decline has, the rate of decline has slowed down following the ban on diclofenac. So in both cases, so this is where diclofenac was banned. Okay. And other thing is also they've been predicting that based on the amount of diclofenac in carcasses, what should be the rate of decline for all these species. Even the predicted rate of decline has gone down from 43% annually to 18% annually. Okay. One of the other observations from these surveys is also that in the most recent surveys in 2012 and 2015, what they have seen is 99% of white drum detections and 87% of longbill detections have been from national parks, not outside. Okay, either in the immediate vicinity or within national parks. So one of the hypotheses that I am testing through my project is trying to understand if it is because these vultures in the national park mostly eat wild prey, which obviously doesn't contain diclofenac. So one of the work that I do is basically get these droppings of vultures from the wild, and we extract the DNA and we sequence them to identify all the species that they have fed on. So I'm able to identify if it is eaten cow or deer or buffalo or whatever. So that's an ongoing project. They've also been, as I told you, they've been testing potential alternatives for diclofenac. So far they've only come across naloxone, and they've also been testing other drugs that are available, currently being used in veterinary practices for similar uses. And all these drugs, which are quite popular, ketoprofen, acetylphenac, nimesulide, they are all, there's evidence that they are all toxic to vultures. And these are not banned yet. They have just figured out that they are toxic, and they are still being used in veterinary practices quite commonly. Okay. So alongside that, there is also because when the decline was so high, when a species starts declining at such a sharp rate or whatever, and when you have lost 99% of the population, you can't take chances. So they also started a conservation breeding center. So they basically got a lot of birds from different populations in the country and wanted to make sure that at least if it completely gets wiped out in the wild, we still have a reserve stock that we can use to repopulate once the diclofenac or whatever the threat is completely mitigated in the environment. So the first breeding center came up in Pinjore in Haryana in 2004, I think, and now there are 8 centers in India, and there's a population of over 200 individuals for all the species, all 3 species in these centers. And there's also one in Nepal now. Pakistan also has a smaller facility. So what they do in these conservation breeding centers is basically they have these large aviaries and they try to keep them in a situation which is as similar to nature as possible. So for example, white-crowned vultures, because they're colonial nesting birds, a lot of birds are kept together, and then there are mixed aviaries of slender-billed and white-crowned because they often occur together, both nest on trees. And they also practice something called as double clutching. So vultures in nature, they produce just one egg every year. So what they do is when they lay the first egg, they remove it, and immediately the pair lays another egg. So, and both the eggs are actually, just to increase the hatching success, they use an artificial incubator to incubate the egg. And once the chicks hatch, they return to the parent and then they feed them. So so basically using this, they are trying to increase the number of vultures that can be produced in the same time duration. And of course, to feed these vultures, they buy goats and they are kept in quarantine for a week to make sure that if there is any chance of any of them having been treated with diclofenac, it's removed out of the system. And then the goats are slaughtered and fed to these vultures. And so the eventual goal of captive breeding like this is to be able to reintroduce the captively bred individuals into the wild. And unfortunately in India, they haven't been able to do it so far. So this is one, so they released one test, so one Himalayan griffin which was injured and reared at the captive breeding center, they just released it just to test it. But the thing is, so far they have been having two problems. As I told you, the simulation says even 0.8% of the carcasses containing diclofenac is enough to decimate the population. Around Pinjore, where they want to release the bird, the amount of diclofenac in carcasses is more than 2%, even now, after all the conservation efforts. So it's still not safe. Second thing is, they want, when you release such birds, you also want to track how they are doing, right? You want to track how they are moving, what is the fate. So they want to put satellite transmitters on them, and they've been having some problem with the government about permissions to put these kind of transmitters on vultures. On the other hand, Nepal has been very successful. So they have bred a lot of vultures. They are focusing on just two species, slender-billed and white-crowned, because that's what occurs in their country. And so far they have managed beautifully. So they have managed to reduce the amount of diclofenac in pharmacies and all to almost zero, according to the latest surveys. And so far they have released 31 captively bred birds into the wild, and many of them have started breeding around those areas and all. So they are doing much better than us so far. Secondly, so that was the ex-situ conservation effort, which is out of the wild. We have a captive breeding facilities where we are trying to raise insurance stock of birds. But in the wild also there are conservation efforts going on. So there's this concept called vulture safe zones. So the idea is that wherever there's a sizable colony of vultures, you try to make a radius of 50 kilometers around it diclofenac free. So basically, once a place is identified as a vulture safe zone, they spend a lot of time in doing advocacy. So basically going around, meeting people, talking to veterinary doctors, pharmacies, to remove diclofenac from their immediate environment. In many places, like particularly in Nepal, they've also started something called vulture restaurants. Basically, they buy livestock or goats and stuff, they quarantine them for 7-8 days, then they slaughter them and provide the food to vultures, just to make sure that they get safe food. And other thing is, the idea is also that once they are able to secure these vulture safe zones, they'll serve as ideal sites to release captively bred birds as well. So currently we have vulture safe zones in one site in Nepal, there's one around the Pinjore breeding center in Haryana, there's one in Uttar Pradesh and Gujarat. So also because vultures span multiple countries, the conservation efforts have been an international collaborative effort. So basically there are multiple organizations, more than 20, all of them have organized themselves under one banner called SAVE. So SAVE is basically Saving Asia's Vultures from Extinction. So this is like a collaborative consortium, and this particular group works across all the range countries. So India, Pakistan, Nepal, Bangladesh and Cambodia. And the partners include both government agencies, NGOs working on raptor conservation, and research institutions. And there are annual meetings of SAVE where basically everybody shares their experiences, and they also take stock of what's going well, what's not working very well, how to improve things. Okay. Finally, I'll come with the stages that Umesh talked about in effectively conserving birds and what has been happening with vultures with respect to those points. So first was discovering population declines that happened in case of vultures in 1998 and 99. Then setting priorities, and one of the criteria that he talked about was just recognizing the threat that they face. So recognizing the threat to vultures, white-trunked vulture was declared as critically endangered in 2000, and long-billed and center-billed vultures in 2002. The third point was understanding the biological reasons behind why they are undergoing the decline. This happened for vultures in 2003 when they identified diclofenac to be the primary cause. Identifying actionable steps, which is when conservationists in India and Nepal came together and demanded a ban on veterinary use of diclofenac. The captive breeding program was also started during that time. The socio-economic and political context here, with respect to vultures, it was mostly, it dealt with lobbying with the government and making them come up with these bans and guidelines and stuff. Then implementing the steps, so 2006, the ban came up, meloxicam was identified as an alternative to diclofenac, and SAVE as a consortium came up in 2011. And in terms of measuring the outcomes or monitoring the population is being monitored, and they're also simultaneously monitoring the amount of diclofenac in the environment. And with respect to adaptively managing emerging threats in case of vultures, for instance, it's still an ongoing process. So in Northeast India, persecution is like retaliatory poisoning, unintentional retaliatory poisoning is turning out to be a major threat for vultures. So there are some groups which have started working. And one of the gaps that needs to be addressed with respect to vulture conservation is the socio-economic context. Like, we still don't understand when everybody knows that diclofenac is the cause and it needs to be removed. Why do veterinary practitioners still, yeah, they are exactly cheaper or whatever, they still prescribe diclofenac in rural areas. And it's so much so that now ampules meant for human use, they sell multiple vials of that for veterinary use. So talking to some veterinarians, they've said that there's this faith that veterinarians have on diclofenac. Yeah, so some work can be done there on what motivates them into still continuing with it despite knowing all these effects, and what could be potentially done to convince them to really stop doing this here. Okay, thank you.